following program is made possible in part by the Dayton Bar Association. The following program is made possible in part by the Dayton Bar Association.
Good evening, and welcome to You in the Law. My name is Jeff Swillinger. I'm your host of this program, and we welcome you here this evening. This is a monthly call-in show. You will see the number on the screen at different times throughout the program. There it is, 937-223-5311. The show is live. I would refer you to www.datv.org for information about where the show is being shown. You can also live stream the show, and there are instructions on the DATV website. I don't like to spend a lot of time talking about all those kinds of details, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the show is underwritten by the Dayton Bar Association, and at times during the show you will see a number for the Dayton Bar Association, and particularly the lawyer referral service. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest, Jane Novick. And Jane is here this evening to talk about disability rights. I think we're very fortunate to have Jane. She has been in Dayton since, I think, about 1996. 91. And Jane is an attorney, and she will tell you what areas of disability rights she will be talking about this evening. So let's get started. Jane, good evening and welcome.
Thank you very much.
Well, you're most welcome, and thank you for being here. So let's get started with a little bit of background information about you, and we'll kind of build on that.
Well, as you said, I came here in 91. I came from the little town of New York City, so a little bit of a change. I actually started out as an international economist. I worked at the New York Federal Reserve, and I then took quite a number of years off because my second of 4 children was born developmentally delayed. When I was ready to go back to work, really my economics work was not going to be viable here, and I realized all the years I had done advocacy for people with disabilities that I could use those skills by going to law school, and at that point I was in a position where I could provide a lot of legal services for people who could not afford an attorney, and access to justice is a very important thing for me. So I have done a lot of work, particularly in special education and employment, as far as not employment discrimination, but helping people with employment in the community. And from that leapfrogged into my working in the juvenile court, and now I run the court-appointed special advocate program, a national program for which Judge Capizzi from the juvenile court actually sits on their board. And we deal with a lot of children in the juvenile court who actually have disabilities. So even though I'm not the attorney there per se, I'm able to do a lot of work in that area. So I really have taken a very circuitous route to doing many different things in my life.
So this is not merely a job for you. In fact, more importantly, it's a passion and something that has been a part of your family and your professional life for a long time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, I understand. Well, that's a quick and thorough synopsis of how you got to where you are today here in this particular area of the law. Let's talk about a phrase that you used in a conversation with me recently, and topic of a nice article that was written in the course of an interview with you as Barrister of the Month for the Dayton Bar Association recently, where you talked about disability as a culture.
Yes.
Tell us what you mean by that.
It's quite interesting because, again, I started out, I have a master's in international affairs. Cultures are very interesting and important to me, and disability is really another manifestation of that. And I think that people don't understand that when you're going to be working or interacting with someone who has some type of disability, you need to understand, just like if you meet somebody from another country, you need to understand the different foods, the different ways they act, all the mannerisms. Well, it's the same thing with a disability. And they're all a little different. I kind of use the example when I was moving to Dayton, and I told some of the people in New York I was moving there, they said to me, "Oh, does everyone wear overalls and a straw hat?" And why do they say that? Because they either saw it in a movie, a TV show, read it in a book, so therefore everybody in the Midwest is like that. And of course we know the Midwest goes from very rural to very urban areas, and you can't stereotype or lump everyone in one group. Well, that's the same thing with a disability. Just because someone's a disability, that is why people first language is so important. We don't focus on the disability. We focus on the fact that this is a human being, no different than you and I are, that happens to have a disability. So it's just like, I come from New York, but I am a person who comes from there, and so I happen to talk a little differently than people who were born here. So the focus is the fact, and I like it because it's a unifier. We are all human beings. We are a man or woman or whatever the gender is that somebody identifies as, and then we can add all those adjectives afterwards. And I think people don't realize the subconscious effect that these words have. An example I'll give you is I was representing somebody, and in the complaint they said that the mother was wheelchair bound. And I said, I'd like that taken out of the complaint. I said, first of all, she can get out of a wheelchair. I've seen that. So she's not wheelchair bound. I've seen her scoot around. And secondly, I said, who's going to ever want to return custody to a mother who is wheelchair bound? People are going to think, how's she going to run after a child? What if the child gets hurt? How's she going to give the child a bath? All of these things are going to conjure up, even if you don't realize it, these images, and you're going to be quite hesitant to return custody. So I think we do need to be very careful about those words that we use. And we need to understand, just like we need to understand what's really accessible to someone. How can I determine that? We need to ask the person themselves. And you can describe to them, okay, my house has a ramp, and I've gone through that when I've had people use wheelchairs. Okay, I have a ramp and it's this much of an incline, and they can tell me if that's viable for them or not. I can't decide that. So these are all very important things that we don't want to make a judgment about. We need to ask the person who lives that situation.
Okay, so as you're talking, I'm trying to figure out where the starting point is for educating people. In your particular situation and context, you have a daughter that you mentioned has a developmental, how did you put it?
Disability.
That's not the term you used, though, was it?
I might have said, or she was developmentally delayed.
Yes, okay, I think. And so I would guess that really created a heightened awareness for you more than ever before once your daughter was born. Is that fair?
I was introduced to a culture
Yeah.
I had very little exposure to before.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So there are a lot of people out there who may not have an experience such as that. And just as we take off on the subject, how can people who want to learn more about and be more thoughtful and more sensitive and more open, where do they start, you think?
Well, first of all, from what, again, I'm not going to speak for the disability world.
Sure.
I'm not per se a part of it, and again, they're all different. I just know that what I have been told is there is nothing wrong in asking questions. It's just being respectful. Again, I don't see the double standards. I see it's the same thing with any person. and that you would speak to them the same way. And if you don't understand something, so for example, if I'm with somebody who is speaking another language, and maybe I know some of that language, but I didn't understand that word, I would ask them, I didn't understand that, would you explain it? So I think there's no difference. I think we need to realize we treat everybody the same. We ask. I know I've always heard from people who are visually impaired, don't just grab my arm, ask me if I need help. I can tell you. And actually, I think it's a great segue into one area of disability rights, and that's guardianships. People think that just because somebody needs a guardian, and we'll explain that in a minute, that you become their dictator. So we need to think about that. A guardian is, in the legal terms, means somebody has been found, they've been adjudicated incompetent. And I hate that word, but that's what the law says. In other words, they really cannot make day-to-day decisions about their life. That being said, that doesn't mean they can't make any decisions. So I'll give you an example. It may seem silly, but it's not really. If I take my daughter to go buy a coat, and I have an image in my mind about what would be the right type of coat, and she latches on to a coat, and this actually happened, that was off-white, and she liked it, it seemed soft and comfortable. Okay, I had something else in mind. It fit her, it was appropriate, it didn't make her look ridiculous, it was going to keep her warm, but I wouldn't have picked it out. I'm her guardian. I get to make all her decisions, but I'm not her dictator, and I have to still give her respect to make decisions when she's capable of it. And so she could make that decision. Now, if she told me she wanted to wear the coat when it was 90 degrees outside, that would be a different story. So again, to me, there's no double standard. Treat another person with respect. And approach them in a way that they can understand. So if you have someone with cognition issues, maybe you use simpler language, you speak slower, you break things down, but you give them the opportunity, to understand that they have wishes, wants, desires, likes, dislikes like anybody else. And so that's something important in a guardianship. So even though you may need to make a lot of those decisions, you want to give them that respect. Or maybe you want to discuss with them, different options, but you only give them options that you know are good options and viable, but yet they're still getting to make a choice. So again, we have to work within, what's reasonable and realistic for that person, but showing them respect. No different than I would do with anyone. It's the same thing, just like if you have a client, as an attorney, you need to speak to them in language they understand. You can't always use legal language. You have to break it down into layman's. This is the same thing.
One of the things we talked about that I think relates to this, and I'd like you to talk about some more, is labels and how you don't like labels when we're talking about disability and the disability culture. Why don't you talk about that a little bit, how that relates to what you're saying? Because I would imagine that when people, I'd say the non-guardian, is in a situation where they come in contact with someone that may have a developmental disability, and they're already maybe a little uncomfortable, not sure what they can say, even if they're trying to be as positive as possible, they're possibly putting a label on that person already. How do you address that?
I mean, I think we all need to be aware of implicit bias. We all have it, and it's not like bias is bad. I mean, we're a product of our environment, our experiences, and of course they're going to, affect us. Again, another example is if someone asks me do I live in a big city? To me, no, because I come from New York City. My idea of a big city is New York City. But if I ask somebody who comes from Arcanum, say, they're going to say, yes, Dayton's a big city. Is one right and the other wrong? No, it's our perspective, right. And I think we have to be aware of that. Well, that's the same thing with a label. I mean, if you say somebody has Down syndrome, and I had this, it's funny, today, people conjure up an image, but there's a spectrum. Again, no different than anybody else. I've seen people with Down syndrome go to college. I'm friends with, there's one young man, he was on a TV show, I don't remember the name, it was some years ago, and he played the character of Corky. And,
Yes.
and I actually know the family. He lives on his own. I mean, he has a band. He travels all over to someone with Downs who is severely disabled and needs a lot of help. So that's the problem with a label, is that, you know, it conjures up an image. And it's funny, my husband said to me when my daughter was little, and I was like, I just want to know what's the matter with her. He said, you know what, be happy. You actually don't have that. And in retrospect, it's true. She has no label, so people can't tell me what she will be able to do and what she won't be able to do because they don't have a label for her. So I think that is very important to be a little careful. Autism, we even say, is on the spectrum.
Right.
It's the same thing. So we do have to be careful because, again, we're going to go by, let's say we met somebody who had autism. So to us, that represents all of autism. That's not true. Just like, you know, I don't represent every female in the world. I don't represent every attorney. We have to be very careful that our experiences do not mean, they're anecdotal. They do not represent everybody in that situation.
It seems to me that there's almost a bit of caution that people should have. They should move to their judgment very slowly if they're not sure how they're approaching if they're approaching someone properly and they want to know more about them, but they feel that that person may not be the same they are, and that could apply to any number of situations. But in this situation, but rather than to jump into something and label someone or characterize or mischaracterize somebody, I think people, even out of the greatest goodness in their heart at times, might rush into a situation and say, oh, this or oh, that. You've seen situations like that, yes?
Yeah, we have to be careful. For example, I'm a very big believer that many people that have a disability can work in the community. Mm-hmm. And by working in the community, I do not mean that you have a group of 5 people with a disability working together mm-hmm. in the community. That's not the community because they're really mm-hmm. in their little enclave mm-hmm. in the community. But I remember when my daughter was getting ready to transition from high school to work, everyone said to me, she needs a sheltered workshop. She won't make it in the community. She can't do it.
Will you explain what that is in the course of?
A sheltered enclave is pretty much an isolated facility where work is brought in there from an outside company, and it's piecework usually that they're doing there. So they're really very protected. It's only people with disabilities. And they told me that's really where she needed to be, and she couldn't work outside. And I've been in those places, and I've seen people far less disabled than my daughter there, and I always thought, how sad. So I got my daughter a volunteer position, and I wound up being the job coach in the beginning, which is kind of a scary thought because I really don't know much about it. And then I asked for a real job coach. And it was very interesting. The job coach I initially got came from one of those sheltered workshops. And so my daughter really wasn't getting anywhere. And then I asked for a job coach from another organization that worked with individuals that were going to be independent out in the workforce. And within 2 months, she never needed a job coach again. This is the person that everyone told me could never work in the community. She was highly successful. And when she eventually left, because she's in a group home back in New York, 100 people came, and people would tell us that they were always going to eat in that cafeteria where she worked because she made them feel good. This was a person who should never be working there. And when the person from the agencies that work with people with disabilities would come and want to speak to her, she said, I'm busy, I'm working. and that I can't eat with you, I'm eating with my friends, and her friends were the regular staff that worked there. So the trouble is, if I bought into that, that she can't do this, without giving her a chance, she never would have done that. So I think, again, it's just like if you or I tell our own children, you can't do math, you're just not good at it, whether they're good or not, they're not going to be good because we've talked them into it. It is the same thing. Let's not assume, because of the way somebody looks, or talks, that they automatically can't do something. Let's give them opportunities. And that's part of what we have under IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is that they get a chance for vocational or even academic opportunities, and with the right supports. And that's something very important that we want to do for people.
Will you tell people about that, what that act is a little bit more,
Sure.
whether it's federal, state, how it's applied, that type of thing?
IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is a federal law, but we have a state law under the Ohio Revised Code. And that is for children from birth until the age of 22, or if they take their high school diploma, whichever comes first. Now, for people that have graduated from high school, then we go to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and that is more of a civil rights act. But that one will help. So, for example,
Also federal law.
Federal law. That one helps more in, let's say somebody is visually impaired and they're in college. If they could do the work as somebody who is not disabled, but with reasonable accommodations, in other words, not an undue burden on that entity, then that would mean that college would have to provide the software for the computer so that the person who's visually impaired could do the work. There is a section of it that is in the public school, but it doesn't have the same teeth as IDEA. So IDEA basically, and actually the Supreme Court only a couple years ago made a ruling that they hadn't in 35 years, a little more on the education standard, and they said it must be reasonably calculated, okay, to give them some, education. So it doesn't require the best education, but reasonably calculated, to give them what they need education-wise. And they also get related services if needed. So that would be occupational therapy, speech therapy, counseling, things of that nature as well. And it's all about giving someone that opportunity to thrive in that setting. So somebody on an IEP can wind up still going on to college, could wind up going through a program like the Career Technology Center, where mechanics, cosmetology certification, or that they're going to just go from high school right into a job. So it helps in many different ways. It provides a lot of services for individuals. So that's a very incredible thing that we have here to help people with disabilities.
I wanted to point out that you provided a list of resources for folks who are watching the show. They might look to relative to addressing disability matters, disability rights. Some of those will be appearing on the screen. Jan will talk about those a little. She doesn't have the same screen that I do, so I see where that's coming up. But if we could show it on the screen to my right, that would be helpful for both of us, I think. But I want to step back for a second, because it seems to me, just from, I'll call myself a lay person here in this context, it seems to me that in the context of, let's say, a lineal progression of a disability situation, people are faced with this in any number of situations, from possibly childbirth, where one has a child that is determined to have a disability. Maybe someone becomes someone's guardian of a young adult or an older adult later in life. when people are not necessarily, they don't have a background in addressing disability issues. We've talked about different laws, we've talked about different ways of approaching people, we've talked about disability as a culture and not labeling people too quickly, but on more of a linear scale, what do you see, what have you seen in your practice over the years when people are faced with these issues? You can kind of bring this together in somewhat of a linear fashion and maybe talk about some of the resources in the community that are available to helping people. I know you as a very intelligent, very passionate person about this work and about this as part of your life. But I would think that there are people out there that don't come to the table with maybe the same resources you did, the same perspective. And I don't mean financial resources, just your approach to life, okay? And as I've come to know you, what do you want people to know as they move in the direction of assisting someone with a disability? Where can they look for in this greater Dayton area for specific resources? And we can get some of that list up on the board. And how that may vary depending, I know you don't like labels, but there are different types of disabilities. If you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the saddest things is that access to resources is not easy, it's not centralized, and yes, when you're in the throes of trying to figure things out, people don't always have the time, the knowledge, to find them. So there's a lot of different ways. One way I'm going to start with is something I have on my website, even though it's for court-appointed special advocates. As I said, we deal a lot with people with disabilities. If you go to our website, which is www.CASA, CASAMC, for Montgomery County.com, on there is a tab for resources. It is free, it's open to anyone, and it is on a myriad of topics dealing with, and quite a few of them deal with disability issues. So that's number one. And on there are some of the other things I'm going to mention. Both Dayton Children's Hospital and Cincinnati Children's Hospital have a ton of resources actually on their websites.
And I imagine it would list what departments people could go to, so they don't just call the general line at the hospital and not know exactly who to ask for to the website. If they can look to the website first, to give them some direction.
Yeah, there's like resources there. Like for Dayton Children's, there's something, a tab on resources, and it has support groups, for example, and it'll list all the different support groups and who to contact. So absolutely. The Ohio Department of Education, there's a resource tab there as well, on obviously education issues. And for example, not everybody can afford an attorney, absolutely. So on there is a list too, well, one mostly for this audience would be a facilitator. So if you're having difficulty negotiating your IEP, which is the Individualized Education Program.
So you have a student who's in school and a determination has been made that they need an individualized educational plan.
Yes, so they fall under IDEA, they're eligible, they have a disability, and so they get an individualized plan which spells out the services that they're going to get and the supports. But you as a parent may have one view and the school may have a different. If you're having difficulty kind of negotiating that and mediating out a settlement as far as what will that IEP looks like, on the Ohio Department of Education's website, there are a list of facilitators. They are free, they have a bio, and you can ask to have one. And the school and the family have to agree on one, and they will come in and help to negotiate. So that's another great resource. Okay. Another resource dealing with, it's almost like legal aid, but for disability issues, is Disability Rights of Ohio. They're a phenomenal organization. They are made up of attorneys and advocates Sometimes you just need that advocate to help you, to steer you in the direction of all the different resources. And sometimes, the attorneys will take over, and they do incredible work. It's on different disability issues.
That it's up on the screen right now, as if some of the other resources you've been mentioning have been coming across on the screen. I think one of the questions that often comes up in this program when we're talking about access to justice, so to speak, is money. These different resources, we'll stick with that term that you've been speaking about, should people be fearful about reaching out to them because of initial cost, or in most cases are people there to help and at least get you into the system and see what level of resource you need? How does that work as far as money goes?
Well, as I said with facilitators, they're free.
Okay.
I love that word. As I told you, access to justice is important to me.
Right.
I mean, I'm now the president of the Volunteer Lawyers Project, so that's very important to me. Disability Rights of Ohio, I told you that is like legal aid. That is free as well. Many of these supports that the two hospitals have are free. So no, I am giving you mostly free resources, and a lot of the ones on my website are free. Because, as I said to you, access to resources should not, there should not be barriers for people. That's just wrong.
Okay, and when you referred to your website, you're back to the CASA website.
Correct.
Okay. Do you want to talk a little bit back up for a moment and talk about CASA? Use the full name again, and not just the acronym, or at least connect the two, and let people know how that relates directly to what we're talking about.
CASA, Court Appointed Special Advocates, is a national organization.
Right.
It is primarily for children that are alleged to be abused or neglected, and the courts need a neutral person there to help them decide what would be in the child's best interest. So you're advocating for the child's best interest. In our court, many of these children have some disabilities, not at all uncommon. So many of my volunteers actually are former special educators or social workers or doctors or nurses, which is really very helpful because, again, you need to know how to access resources to help a child with a disability. We go into the schools and we will advocate during an IEP meeting to try and get the best situation for the child. And when there is no parent around, many of my volunteers were certified as parent surrogates, which allows them to go in and kind of act in place of a parent and advocate in an IEP. And for people who are not part of the CASA system, that's where I say a facilitator can come in and help. So we do all different things. Children with medical needs, we will go in there and work with the hospitals and make sure that the medical services are being provided for the children. We will make sure that their educational needs, also that they're getting enrolled. If they move from school to school, we want to make sure that they're still getting their educational needs. So in many different ways, they are, again, advocating that the rights of a child with disability is still there.
Okay, it looks to me like we have a caller on line one. Good evening, caller. Welcome to the show. How can we help you?
Hi, I just wanted to tell you that I'm finding this very educational, and I find this Novick very easy.
Excuse me, 1 second. We're getting some feedback. I don't know if you're near how that works with this. Quite frankly, it's the first time I've faced that, but maybe if you can talk into the phone away from any other electronics, that might help.
Okay. So repeat it. I just wanted to say that I'm
That's better.
finding this very enlightening, very educational, and this Novick is extremely easy to understand. So, yes, the layman's terms that she's using is making this, very relevant to me in my job, and I'm finding this wonderfully educational. So thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to talk about this any further, or do you have any questions you'd like to ask of Jane this evening?
No, she is, no, but I wanted to say, especially what she said about the no labels and talking about everyone has the box. And, you know, I can't remember the word exactly that you used, but we said we don't know that we have. And we just talked about this earlier this year.
Okay. Well, thank you. I will tell you, we're having a little difficulty, and I don't know if it's at our end or your end. Your call is breaking up, and I'm sorry. But I understand the overriding nature of it was to call in and be positive and supportive of what Jane has been talking about, and we really appreciate that. And we thank you. And am I to understand, though, that you work possibly as a CASA volunteer, or you interface with some of the individuals or organizations that Jane's been talking about?
With students with disabilities in the traditional educational setting.
Oh, okay, very good. Very, very good. Well, we thank you for what I'm sure is your good work, and we appreciate your calling in, and we'll continue with our discussion. And if you have any questions, we have about another 20 minutes. You're welcome to call back. We can try this again, see if it's a little clearer. But nonetheless, we thank you for your call.
So is it,
Good night.
there's
Jane?
a lot of issues within some of these topics. So I mean, let's look a little more. Let's explore a little more with education.
Okay.
Because, as I said, certainly I see it a lot in my work with the court-appointed special advocates. But we see this on the outside all the time. For example, why children who are on an IEP can stay in school until they turn 22. And people might say, why would I want my child to stay in school longer? Why is that a good thing? What are the benefits? So let's discuss that for a minute.
Okay.
So a child could leave at 18, 19, go the regular course. But what happens if they stay longer? Okay, well, several things. Number one is, first of all, they can have a social graduation, which means they can walk with their peers at the time they would have had they just gone the regular 4 years of high school. They can be part of the social part. They can wear the cap and gown, go to all the parties, have all of that part, but they don't actually take their diploma. They get a blank piece of paper. And then why would they come back? Well, many reasons. First of all, what if they need to take things a little slower? So again, I'll draw on a private case where this young man really wanted to go into the IT field, but he needed to take courses a little slower, and he really was going to need to get into his courses, the IT part. He wasn't going to be ready for that until he was really 19, 20. Well, that would have been when he would have been graduating, but now he still had another 2 years. So if he did a program like Career Technology Center after graduation, he'd have to pay for it. If he does it part of high school, it's free. I told you I love the word free because then it's more people have access to that. Not everybody could afford to pay for it afterwards, but if they're in school, then it's open to anybody. That's like phenomenal. That's number one. Number two is it's just allowing someone to go at their pace. We want success. That's really important. For people who are more on a vocational track, it's going to give them more time to try different jobs, see what they're good at, see what they like, and have a job coach. Because again, when you get out in the world, if it's a volunteer job, you're probably not going to get a job coach. If you have a paid job, you get a job coach, but for a relatively short amount of time. If you're in school, that's part of that vocational process. You have a job coach. So it's giving you more time for job readiness, for, as I said, job exploration, seeing what's going to work. And again, that's building up for a better chance at success when you get out. That's all important. You know, it can be, there was an individual who really loved working with arcade type games, but he didn't have the ability to like do the mechanics or repairs or things like that. They eventually wound up getting him a job kind of doing a lot of janitorial work in one of these centers. For him, he was really happy. He was around it, you know, but he was doing a job he could do. And so sometimes that takes time because part of that process is person-centered planning, which means you get the individual along with maybe the parents, along with the teachers, and maybe it's been people where he's worked, maybe it's been other people who know the individual, and everyone talks about what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, what are the likes and what are the dislikes. It's, if you think about it, it's a process we all go through just in a less formalized way.
Who leads, who's the conductor there? Who brings all of those different people and or resources together in that context?
Usually that's going to be like the special ed teacher who
Okay.
will do that. And again, you know, gone are the days where the only thing you could do are janitorial work or, you know, fast food. That's gone. It's not like you have to take that round peg and it has to fit into the square hole. That doesn't exist anymore. Now we need to have that conversation. And again, I'll draw from my daughter. That's an easy one. She loves animals. So one time they gave her a job wrapping silverware. That was like the kiss of death for her. She didn't want that. She wanted to be with people, and she loved animals. So it's like, okay, so now you have to cultivate a place that would be good for her. And that's more where we are today. But you're only going to get there if you have that conversation. And then sometimes it takes time. Okay, you've tried one place, that didn't work. So what do we need to do a little differently? And as I said, like that example I gave you of that young man, we have to get creative about it. An example I was told quite a few years ago, I thought was very clever. This young man had access to a laminating machine. And there was a company that laminated maps, but they would send those out to be laminated. They found it was cheaper to have this young man bring the machine and do the lamination in their company than to send it out. And it was a win-win. I love this out-of-the-box thinking.
Sure.
You know?
Well, it seems to me that just implicit in the stories you've told, it's been a voyage to get there.
Sure.
It's taken time. That type of view of things wasn't always present. Let me ask you about a few terms that you've used. I want to just amplify those.
Sure.
In the context of school, I imagine, and maybe we're back to IEPs, the concept of a parent surrogate, when does that come up?
That comes up more with in children's services cases.
Oh, okay.
If a parent is unable to be located, really cannot participate in their educational rights that they would have as a parent, you need somebody who can sign off as the parent. So you can, through the Ohio Department of Education, you can get certified as a parent surrogate. And as I said, quite a few of my volunteers are certified as surrogates. I am also. And so they can go to that IEP, they can sign off that whether they approve of it, not approve of it, you know, they have that final say. So that's what that is.
And people can learn more about that as one part of the ODE, Ohio Department of Education's website, I presume?
Absolutely. And I will tell you, there is a great need for that. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of situations where children don't have a parent that is around, involved, and the schools need someone, and the children need someone to advocate for them. as I said, you know, a case where we have children's services involved, we have our CASAs, the guardian ad litems, who are involved and advocate. But some of these children need a parent surrogate as well who can advocate for them.
I would imagine that there are some instances, and I wanted to get back to some of those terms I wanted a little bit more explanation on, but the situations you're talking about, can you give an example of one where maybe what the best interest of the child is not what the parent sees as the best interest of the child, but for one reason or another, the cases come before children's services, the child is struggling in school, for some reason there's a conflict. Can you give us an example of a situation like that and how, in this context of special needs, that might get addressed?
Well, one reason why a children's services case may come about is through educational neglect. So, and it could be a child with special needs. For example, they're not sending the child to school at all. So we have this truancy. So there you definitely have a conflict as far as what the parent might be doing and what the child's needs are. And I'm not saying sometimes there aren't real reasons why that parent hasn't sent the child. You know, there are struggles. You know, we've had a very big problem in Montgomery County with opioid use and, of course, now also methamphetamine. That is a reason children don't always wind up going to school. So that can be another reason. Then there are parents who don't want their child labeled as having a disability. That comes up a lot as well. Or sometimes they want certain things that the school doesn't think are necessary. One big one is some parents think their child needs an aid just for them, and that's not always something that schools are going to agree on. And then sometimes children, for example, need eyeglasses. And I know there was one case where the mother just was never sending it. She never took her child for speech or occupational therapy. And so Children's Services got involved because Children's Services wants to make sure that that child gets the services that they need as well.
Okay, okay. Now I can imagine there's conflict sometimes. Who represents the child in those situations? Who represents the parents? If it gets to a point where there's real tension between what the school wants or is recommending or what Children's Services is recommending, can you identify where the CASA volunteers come into play or guardian ad litem comes into play? Would you explain that for folks who are listening?
So Children's Services is represented by our prosecutors. They represent the agency, the Children's Services agency. Parents, when there's a Children's Services case, the biological or adoptive parent is given an attorney if they are unable to afford one themselves. So they have representation. A child only receives representation if the child's wishes differ from the wishes of the CASA or the guardian ad litem, who could be an attorney, not acting as an attorney, but acting as a guardian ad litem. And again, guardian ad litem, CASA, guardian ad litem, they are there to advocate for what's in the best interest of children. And as we know, children's, what they think is best for them is not always what is best.
So there are some children that might say, I know what's best, and they don't. There might be some children that cannot articulate what is best for them for some reason. Maybe it's the nature of their disability. Who becomes the advocate then to make, I guess the initial determination as to how some advocate for that child is going to, or who that's going to be, or how they're going to be selected, where they're going to come from?
Well, the CASA or the
CASA,
guardian ad litem is the advocate. That is their job, to advocate for what is in the best interest for that child.
So sometimes the court will appoint someone even if the child doesn't want that or doesn't think that's what they need, or that's
it has nothing to do with that.
Well, I'm trying to understand.
automatically, when there's an allegation of abuse or neglect, and usually also even dependency, the law says for abuse and neglect there must be a guardian ad litem there. So that's law. Dependency, which could be a situation like a sad one that we had with the Oregon shooting. A mother was shot, and the child now had no parent. The caregiver was gone. That child's in a vulnerable situation. So through no fault of anybody, this child is in a vulnerable situation. So you might have a guardian ad litem in a case like that as well. But they will always appoint somebody in that case. And then they will sometimes come into other cases as well. And they are there to advocate. And one of the big areas they advocate in is certainly school, educational needs. That becomes very important. But as I said, if a child is able to articulate their wishes and they are different from what, and usually it's more about who they're going to live with than about school, then they come in, then an attorney will represent a child. So that, but that's not as much school type of issues.
Okay. You use the term facilitators, and you said you like facilitators. Now, will you tell us a little bit more of what that term means in this context and how they come into play here?
Sure. So when we have an IEP for a child and parents think the IEP should have certain things, the school thinks differently, and they are unable to come together, they can use a facilitator. As I said, that's from the Ohio Department of Education website.
Okay. Whose responsibility or who has the right to ask for that facilitator? Can it be the school? Can it be the parent?
Yeah, either one.
Okay,
But then
either
they
one.
have to agree on it.
So it's one person.
Correct.
Okay. And if they don't agree, I assume that can come up sometimes. What happens then?
Well, there's a list of them, so you try and find one.
Okay.
And if, again, you want to stay away from using an attorney unless you have no choice. It just ramps everything up.
Okay.
So we try.
Okay. I have very limited knowledge in most of these areas you're talking about, but I have some knowledge of the conflicts that arise once the problems occur. So that's why I like to follow some of these things through, that if it doesn't happen the way it should the first time, what happens next? Because people get frustrated.
Right.
And they feel as though they don't have a shot. And it would seem to me, just to move that to a different thought, one thing it seems like we need to encourage people who are dealing with these issues to get involved very early on, to seek help if they need it. Early access is important, I imagine, to learn not only educational skills, coping skills, life skills to help with the situation, but also to learn about what resources are out there. And I've seen in other contexts people get discouraged. I imagine you would say don't get discouraged. If you're not finding what you want somewhere, look elsewhere. There are plenty of resources out there.
Well, I think a couple of problems. One is we don't always know what we don't know.
Right.
And we tend to believe, and I think there's a good reason to, that if someone became an educator, that they know what they're doing and they care. And I think that's a very good premise to have. But like in any field, and you can fill in the blanks for any field, there are people who take their job more seriously, or maybe someone's taking it seriously, but what they think is good still is not necessarily the only way. So sometimes I think parents have to follow their gut. And if they don't think that this is right, that's why I say, I've given you some of these resources, and they should seek it out and talk to somebody. Now, the other thing is in schools that people have recourse in is if you have a child with autism, there is something called the Autism Scholarship. They can take that money and take their child out of the public school. There are some private schools that deal with autism, or people do home-based learning. I mean, it's only going to pay for services up until that $27,000, but that's one thing. There's another one called the Peterson Scholarship. It's not quite as good, but that's for children who have other types of developmental delays. And again, same thing, you can pull your child out of the public school. You can't keep them in your public school anymore and use other type of education. The other thing is some parents truly believe their child needs to be in a private school, that the public school is unable to provide what is called a free, appropriate public education, FAPE. And sometimes you can't. The easiest example is a child with significant behavioral needs. Schools can't always provide for that. So it's not easy to get, obviously, your school to agree to pay for that. But that's another thing. And again, there's a whole process, and I'm not going to go through all of that.
Well, no, share as much as you can. We have about 2 minutes left, and I always like to ask my guests if there's anything you'd like to add at the end before we get there. So if you want to finish this thought.
So I'm just saying, that is another possibility that parents have as well in the education sector. And as I said, just kind of going full circle, if they feel their child should stay until age 22, to get those services, there is that as well. So there's a lot of different things. I think the other thing people, just to kind of give a little extra on, is there are things for, if you do need Medicaid, because sometimes that is actually the best insurance there for some people. You can work. There are things called Medicaid buy-in for workers with disabilities, just so people know, where you can keep your Medicaid and still work and not have to be impoverished, because I think a lot of times we feel better when we're working and we're productive. There are other financial things that can be done through special needs trusts and something called the stable account, where again you can maintain your public benefits but also have a little more money so that you can enjoy maybe a higher quality of life. There are a lot of things out there, and I would encourage people, and I know you've put the list up there of a lot of the resources to start there. If people have questions, you can get a lot of information from that list that was up there.
Okay. And again, in time we have left, we talked about the Ohio Department of Education, Dayton Children's Hospital, Cincinnati Children's Hospital, Access Center for Independent Living here in Dayton on West 5th Street, United Rehabilitation Services, and Disability Rights of Ohio. All very important and relevant organizations to this discussion. Well, we used up our time. I wish I could ask you a lot more questions here, but I want to thank you very much for being our guest this evening. I appreciate it, and I'm sure our listeners do.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and you're welcome. We'll see you next month, and this program will be on YouTube. Go to the www.datv.org website, and you will find this program on YouTube probably in the next few days. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next month. Good night.